Well, good evening, and thank you so much for coming out on such a chilly evening. I'll start off by saying that I think it's fair to say that anyone with even a smattering of knowledge about Gothic fiction will know that one of the most enduring conventions of this mode of writing, the Gothic, is a preoccupation with Gothic, and by Gothic in that sense, I mean medieval architecture. Primarily Gothic medieval architecture as we encounter it in a state of collapse or dilapidation and ruin. So, to take one example, in an early chapter of Bram Stoker's Dracula, Mina Murray, one of the two fated heroines, records in her journal from Whitby, the seaside town in North Yorkshire, the following entry. Right over the town is the ruin of Whitby Abbey, which was sacked by the Danes and which is the scene of part of Marmion, where the girl was built up in the wall. It is a most noble ruin of immense size and full of beautiful and romantic bits. There is a legend that a white lady is seen in one of the windows. Between it and the town, there is another church, the parish one, round which is a big graveyard, all full of tombstones. This is, to my mind, the nicest spot in Whitby, for it lies right over the town and has a full view of the harbour and all up the bay to where the headland called Kettleness stretches out into the sea. It descends so steeply over the harbour that part of the bank has fallen away and some of the graves have been destroyed. Now, in this passage, Stoker provides what would turn out to be an extremely influential description of Whitby Abbey, the 7th century Christian monastery that later became a Benedictine abbey, but which fell with Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries from 1536 onwards, and which had existed in a state of ruination ever since. Now, perhaps appropriately for a Gothic novel of vampirism, of supernatural agency, of illicit sexual desire, i.e. Dracula, the ruins of Whitby are said in this passage that I've just read to you to be sites of horror and terror. Look at the reference to Marmion. Now that invokes the fate of the nun Constance, who is buried alive in the convent of St. Hilda on the holy island of Lindisfarne in Walter Scott's 1808 poem of the name Marmion. The reference too in the passage to a white lady that is said to haunt the ruins invokes legendary notions of haunting and spectrality within the ruins of Whitby themselves. So what we see in this little passage is the illustration of the title of my lecture, Revenants and Remains. I'm interested in revenants, spirits who return from the dead, and remains. In this case, the material architectural remains of the ancient medieval past, but also remains in the sense of human remains, that which lies or doesn't lie perpetually in the grave. Now, subsequently in the novel, Dracula, the vampiric count, takes the form of a creature who resembles a large dog and comes ashore in England at the headland, running up the 199 steps to the graveyard of St. Mary's Church that stands in the shadows of Whitby Abbey ruins. Now, at this moment in the text, roots of Whitby Abbey rather kind of fade away. They fade into the background of the novel. Nonetheless, I think this example is enough to illustrate my point, my opening gambit, concerning the very intimate connections between Gothic or medieval architecture and a very well-known Gothic fiction, Bram Stoker's Dracula. Indeed, the two are so closely related as to share a name, and more on this as the lecture develops. As you'll know, filmic adaptations of Stoker's novel have exploited these connections, and portions of certain films, filmic remakes of Dracula, like, I don't know if anyone remembers the BBC Two Count Dracula from 1977, actually being filmed on location in Whitby Abbey. More recently, the Abbey has become the come to feature at the heart of Whitby's lively goth scene and annual goth weekend. Now, as you will know, Stoker's vampire fiction was published at the end of the 19th century, 1897. What I want to discuss in this lecture is the earlier literary and architectural tradition that makes a text like Dracula possible. I want to look at where these links that we see between Gothic fiction and Gothic architecture in Stoker's novel, where they set in place. So I'm going to take you right back to the Gothic revival of the 18th century. At this point, I should clarify a term in my title, which someone has asked me about already. What do I mean by the long 18th century? By the long 18th century, I mean simply, rather than seeing the 18th century as a kind of monolith that begins in 1700 and ends in 1800, to conveniently fold over the last 2 decades of the 17th century or go into the first 3 decades of the 19th century to comprise a sense of the long 18th century. You know, cultural movements never just simply end on the 1st of January 1800 and terminate. So historians and literary historians often use the phrase the long 18th century or the long 19th century. That's what we're talking about here. So to go back to the 18th century, an account of the relationship between Gothic fiction and Gothic architecture must surely commence with the figure of Horace Walpole, the very celebrated author of the first Gothic romance and a pioneer in the revival of interest in Gothic architectural forms in the mid to late 18th century. So, 1747, a very young 30-year-old Horace Walpole, who is the youngest son of the Whig Prime Minister Sir Robert Walpole, took out a lease on Chopped Straw Hall in Twickenham, on the north bank of the Thames. Now, the hall had been built in 1698 as a rather modest pair of cottages. In 1749, 2 years after having taken the lease to Chopped Straw Hall, and you can see it on the left of your screen, Walpole bought the freehold to the property outright, and over the next 3 decades proceeded to transform it, or in his words, rather an ugly word, Gothicize Chopped Straw Hall into the extraordinary Gothic architectural fantasy that we know today, Strawberry Hill. The name, he claimed, he had discovered in the old title deeds to the property. But in order to appreciate the novelty of Walpole's achievement, I think it's important to bear in mind that throughout the 18th century, and indeed ever since the revival of classical Roman and Greek culture during the Renaissance, the Gothic architectural style had almost uniformly and routinely been dismissed as the epitome of bad taste, of barbarism. The examples on your screen, I think, will suffice to make my point. These indicate some of the very opprobrious, negative terms in which the Gothic was dismissed. For John Evelyn, at the beginning of the 18th century, the Gothic is a barbarous and an unsightly style, comprising a certain fantastical and licentious manner of building, composed of congestions of heavy, dark melancholy and monkish piles, without any just proportion, use, or beauty, compared with the truly ancient, i.e., the classical. Later in the century, similar views will circulate in Parentalia by Sir Christopher Wren, the leading architect of the leading classical architect. You can see a picture of St. Paul's there. Gothic in Wren's work becomes a synonym for barbarity, for an untamed wildness. He references the Gothic rudeness of the old design, for example. Now, one of the earlier quotations used this phrase monkish piles to associate in relation to Gothic architecture. So the point to be made is that the Gothic style's association with Catholicism, with Catholic pre-Reformation England, only intensified critics' vitriol For many 18th century Protestants, the Gothic signified the superstitions of the Catholic faith that had been hideously memorialized in stone. So classicism, for much of the 18th century, was the favored architectural style, not least at Houghton Hall, the splendid Palladian villa to which Horace Walpole's own father, Sir Robert, had retired in 1742. If you're looking for a point of reference, think of only the east front of this very building, Palladian, Wentworth Woodhouse. Now, this is Walpole's father's house. His son, though, Horace, resists the pervasive taste for classicism. This is the father, Robert. The son resists this taste for classicism, very deliberately choosing instead to refashion the unassuming chopped straw hall in the Gothic style, a very drawn-out process that is rather a piecemeal process too, that commenced in the late 1740s and continues right the way through to the 1770s. The next 30 years of his life, he builds and Gothicizes that rather plain set of cottages. Now, why? There are numerous reasons for Walpole's rather curious, unfashionable, if not sort of facetious choice of a very unfashionable style. He's the son of a prime minister. There are numerous reasons for Walpole's choice of the Gothic style. For some critics, Walpole's favoring of the Gothic over the classical was part of a kind of aesthetic rebellion against his father. It's very clear that it was an attempt on Horace, the son's behalf, to establish for himself at Strawberry Hill a kind of ancestral home of sorts, one that appeared to have medieval or Gothic foundations, but which was really of modern provenance. The entire process, I think, this Gothicizing of Strawberry Hill, was an exercise in simulation. It is the deliberate creation of the illusion of an ancient family seat at Walpole's little Gothic castle in the suburbs. So what I'm suggesting is that there's very little about Strawberry Hill that aspired towards precision, or what architectural historians will refer to as archaeological accuracy, where architecture is concerned. And most of the Gothic aspects of the building and several of its interior fittings, its furniture, its ceilings, its fireplaces, windows, furniture, the vast collection of paintings, the antiquities, the objets d'art that Walpole assembled in this home, most of them were chosen more for their emotive effects, their imaginative effects, than for any kind of archaeological fidelity to the Middle Ages. So critics have frequently noted that Walpole's approach to the Gothic style was characterized by a certain degree of playfulness, a certain degree of counterfeiting, a certain degree of trickery, actual tricks of the eye, not least in his use of papier-mâché to mimic, in that picture that you can see, the appearance of medieval masonry in the hall, but also the fan vaulting that adorns Strawberry Hill's gallery. That is all papier-mâché that you can see there. So Strawberry Hill is often thought of as the architecture of the subjunctive, the architecture of the as if, the subjunctive mode, as if it were a real medieval building, when really it is not at all. Others have suggested, intriguingly, that one of the reasons why Walpole chooses the Gothic style is because it was an architectural language, a mode of signification through which he and his circle of bachelor male friends could articulate their marginalized sexualities, like his close friends John Shute, who owned the Vine, and the artist and the illustrator Richard Bentley. Members of his so-called Strawberry Committee were these friends of his with whom he worked on the Gothicizing of Strawberry Hill, collaboratively. Walpole was what we would now describe as a homosexual man, a gay man, and perhaps his queer choice of the Gothic architectural style was a coded means of expressing his queer sexual identity. It is one line of argument in Walpole's studies. Since Gothic exceeded and rejected the laws of classical architecture as they'd been laid out by Vitruvius in the 10 Books of Architecture, Gothic was also perceived by some 18th century Whigs as the architecture of freedom and liberty. Now, I'm not suggesting that Whigs such as Horace Walpole and his father always built in the Gothic style. And again, this very building is testament to that, a seat of Whiggish power built at least in the East Front in the Palladian style. And there's certainly a tradition in Whiggish political thought and country houses to build in classicism. But nonetheless, there is still a very enduring correlation between Whig politics, the politics of liberty and modern liberalism, with the Gothic style. As we can see, as in the example of the statue, the Gothic temple at Stowe. But yet, these are all interesting reasons. I think Walpole himself gives a far more plausible and heartfelt account of why he chose the Gothic, and related to what I spoke about earlier. I'll read the passage on the screen for you. It is difficult for the noblest Grecian being classical, it is difficult for the noblest Grecian temple to convey half so many impressions to the mind as a cathedral does of the best Gothic taste. Look at that distinction, that opposition between the classical and the Gothic operating there. A proof of skill in the architects and of address in the priests who erected them. The latter, in other words, the priests who built Gothic abbeys, exhausted their knowledge of the passions, the emotions, in composing edifices whose pomp, mechanisms, vaults, tombs, painted windows, gloom, and perspectives infused such sensations or romantic devotion. And they were happy in finding artists capable of executing such machinery. Lovely end to this quotation. One must have taste to be sensible of the beauties of Grecian architecture. That's that official 18th century respectability speaking. This is what is tasteful, the classical, the Grecian. One only wants passions to feel. Gothic. So Walpole, by his own admission, favored the Gothic style at Strawberry Hill because it incited and excited the passions, the imaginative facilities of those who viewed and inhabited the pile, allowing them to take imaginative, transformative journeys into a faded yet rich, lively, and noble British past, a past that for the 18th century was almost invariably referred to by the term Gothic. They didn't have the term medieval in the 18th century. Their term for the medieval was Gothic. So medieval architectural style, Walpole claimed, imprinted what he called the glooms of ancient abbeys on his house. Isn't that a wonderful word, glooms? It's a portmanteau term. He sandwiched together gloom and warmth, signifying the application of a public ecclesiastical form, a form used, an architectural style used for churches, public buildings, ancient architecture, and applying it to a modern private domestic habitation. You can't live in a chilly abbey, can you? So he uses this word glooms, and there you can see an image by the architectural draftsman John Carter, and I think it captures that sense of glooms, imaginative gloominess that excites the imagination, the passions at Strawberry Hill. For Walpole, the Gothic style afforded a point of imaginative access to what he called the true rust of the Barons' wars. He's an antiquary. He travels back in these imaginative reveries into the past. Gothic style is a portal to an enchanted and enchanting realm of romance, Gothic romance, medieval romance, and poetry. Now, there's certainly properties. These are certainly the properties with which Gothic architecture is charged in the Castle of Otranto. Hands up, who's read the Castle of Otranto? Wonderful. The Castle of Otranto, the short supernatural fiction that Walpole published anonymously in London on Christmas Eve in 1764. And which, in a similar act of counterfeiting, very similar to that he performed at Strawberry Hill, he passed off as a rare antiquarian find. An English translation, he said, of a medieval Italian document that had been printed in Naples in the black letter, or the Gothic script, there's the word, in 1529, and recently rediscovered, he said, in the library of a Catholic family, interesting, Catholic family in the north of England. So this is a hoax. He presents this as an antiquarian discovery of an old Italian document that was printed and then translated from the Italian and discovered in the library of an ancient Catholic family in the north of England. Now, readers were initially taken in by Walpole's hoax, but in the second edition of 1765, he kind of comes at or reveals the text's modern provenance. He discloses his authorial identity and he adds for the first time a Gothic story to the subtitle. Now, as literary history teaches us, this moment marks the birth of Gothic fiction in British literature. It's the originating impulse for the mode of writing that we see enacted so many years later in Bram Stoker's Dracula and so many other late 19th century fictions, and which continues to thrill and to terrify and to chill us and to delight us to this day. Let's consider the title of Walpole's The Castle of Otranto for a moment. What do we notice here? Look at the architectural signifier, castle, as well as a reference to Otranto, a coastal town in southern Italy in the Apulia region. Now, for those of you who've been to Otranto in Italy, you might think, he set his novel in the real Castle of Otranto, Aragonese Castle in Lecce. But we need to remember that in titling his novel, Walpole purportedly simply glanced at a map of Italy, finding in the town of Otranto in the Kingdom of Naples what he called a well-sounding or sonorous name. So he was indeed very, very embarrassed when in November 1786, now remember this is over 20 years after having written The Castle of Otranto, he was presented with this watercolor of the southwest view of the real Castle of Otranto in Italy, which had been rendered on site by an artist called Willy Reveley in 1785. He's very embarrassed to learn 20 years later that there is a real Castle of Otranto. I did not even know that there was a Castle of Otranto, he says in a letter. So what happens in Walpole's novel? It's set in medieval Italy, sometime between the First Crusade and the Last Crusade, and it tells the story of a prince by the name of Manfred, who was an overreaching villain who has usurped the principality of Otranto from its legitimate owner, and who resorts to an ever-desperate set of measures in order to secure his very tenuous claims to power. What are these desperate measures that he resorts to? Well, some rather nasty stuff, I'm afraid. He incestuously pursues Isabella, his own intended daughter-in-law, through the labyrinthine reaches of the castle, when her bride, his son, is killed by a massive helmet that falls from the sky in the opening paragraph. He wants to sediment the union so that he can keep control of the Castle of Otranto, so he pursues her. He makes very spurious appeals to the Pope, to dissolve the marriage to his own wife, named in a Shakespearean reference, Hippolyta, to whom he claims to be incestuously related. So this is the first example of supernatural fiction in English literature. And the novel teems with ghosts, with other inexplicable supernatural phenomena. The giant plumed helmet that falls from the sky to crush Conrad, the sickly air in the opening moments. A painted portrait comes mysteriously to life, a bit like Haunted Mansion, Disney's Haunted Mansion, and issues forth as an infernal spectre. A fragmented body of a giant appears in the castle's chambers. The guilt-stricken Manfred, the villain, sees and mistakenly sees what he thinks to believe ghosts, a bit like Macbeth, guiltily projecting the ghost of Banquo. A skeleton wrapped in a hermit's cowl appears as a sign of warning. Blood issues from the nose of a statue. And in the narrative's closing moments, the ghost of Alfonso the Good, dilated to an immense magnitude, we're told, materializes in order to proclaim Theodore his true and legitimate heir as the castle's owner, as the castle falls to ruins around him. So the tradition of Gothic writing that is kind of inaugurated by this text, the supernatural literature of spectres, of wonders, of ghosts, of ghouls, of horror and terror, of enchantment, is initiated in The Castle of Otranto. It's a fiction that bequeaths to the Gothic mode a number of conventions that are very still present in Gothic film and in Gothic literature, and in fact, horror cinema today, although horror cinema is a kind of offshoot of the early Gothic. Now, let's talk a little more about this fascinating text. It's a short text. I hope you'll be inspired to read it. In the preface to the first edition of Otranto, Walpole, in the guise of the editor, William Marshall, remember he's hiding his own authorial persona, and he said, you know, this is an antiquarian discovery that he's found in the library of the ancient Catholic family in the north of England. In the preface to the first edition, Walpole teases his readers with the quotation that you see on your slide. He says, this is really laid in a real castle. The author seems frequently without design to describe particular parts. The chamber, he says, on the right-hand side of the door on the left, the distance from the chapel to Conrad's apartment, these and other passages are strong presuppositions that the author had some certain building in his eye. So what do you think happens? No one knows that Horace Walpole of Strawberry Hill fame has written this novel for the first edition. What happens when the second edition of the text is published in 1765 and Walpole exposes himself as the author? After the disclosure of authorship in the second edition of 1765, that comment pointed readers directly in the direction of Strawberry Hill. And in fact, it became a commonly held belief, one that persists to this very day, that the Castle of Otranto, that Gothic labyrinthine haunted ruin, or haunted castle that becomes a ruin in Walpole's fiction, was a thinly veiled portrait of Strawberry Hill, his own little Gothic castle that, like Otranto, merges both ecclesiastical and castellated forms of Gothic architecture. This is what Frances Burney says, the great 18th century diarist, a playwright, a novelist. This is what Frances Burney says when she visits Strawberry Hill in 1785. She refers to the deep shade in which some of his antique portraits were placed, and the lone sort of look of the unusually shaped apartments in which they were hung brought to mind striking recollections of his castle, Gothic story of the Castle of Otranto. And Walpole kind of enters into the spirit of this, and he playfully writes in letters to his friends, Horace Mann, for example, in 1771, "I myself expect to treasure tomorrow a complete suit of armor of Francis I, which I have brought out of the Crozat collection. It will make a great figure here at Otranto." I think someone might need to plug in the PC. Thomas Chatterton will satirically figure him as Baron Otranto too. So he's associated with his Gothic novel and his house linked to the Gothic novel all the time. Walpole himself will come to emphasize the connections between his Gothic novel and his Gothic villa in the catalogue that he writes for his house. He publishes 2 editions of them in 1774 and 1784, and points out aspects of the novel in the architecture of the house. So that's all very well and fine for now. What I want to do in the second half of this lecture, having spoken a little bit about this Gothic architecture, Gothic fiction connection, I'm not convinced that Otranto is Strawberry Hill, but that's another matter entirely. I'm going to shift the argument a little bit, and I want to talk about this Gothic architecture, Gothic literature relationship in another context. That is, I wanted the ways in which writers of Gothic romance, Gothic fiction, Gothic prose, after Walpole, took direct inspiration, not from modern, light, Gothic revival buildings, and that's key to thinking about Horace Walpole, Gothic revival. I want to look at how other writers of Gothic looked to ruins, survivalist forms of Gothic, that which had survived from the medieval period, as favored settings for their own fictions. So moving away from the Gothic revival and how that originates or sets in place this relationship between architecture and fiction in the Gothic, I want to look at how so many other writers set their Gothic fictions, plays, dramas, poetry in actual, real, ruined Gothic buildings. The haunted ruins of Gothic castles, of abbeys, monasteries, priories, and other fortifications that had survived from the medieval period, and which writers in the 18th century witnessed all around them. I can't move this on. Let's try. Sorry about that. Gothic ruins. So, as I've suggested to you, Otranto, the Castle of Otranto, the novel, ends upon a note of ruin as the castle that the usurping tyrant and his family have occupied collapses around him. In the wake of Walpole, in Gothic writers after Walpole, Gothic writing becomes the writing of Gothic architectural ruin. And it becomes a feature of the form that is foregrounded by the architectural signifiers, the architectural words and terms that appear in the titles of so many late 18th and early 19th century Gothic fictions. So the architectural imagination. Here are some examples on your slide. Just look at these titles of early Gothic novels. Look at the references to priories, castles, abbeys. It becomes an enduring convention. You will know, of course, of Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. It is precisely on that convention that Austen is riffing. We can see a lot of other examples. I could have given you 200 examples. These are just randomly picked. Now, this notion of the architectural imagination, the claim I'm making that Gothic ruin inspires acts of Gothic literary production is not my own academic confection. I'm struck by the ways in which how in the 18th century even, critics of the Gothic, writers in the popular press, dramatists were very aware that Gothic fiction owed its livelihood, its being, to sites of ruin. Now, here's an example. We were talking about the monk earlier, weren't we? Matthew Gregory Lewis is the monk. Matthew Gregory Lewis writes one of the most notorious Gothic novels of the period called The Monk, a romance, 1796. It's not really about architecture. They're not all were. But later, shortly after that, he writes a very successful supernatural drama. It's a Gothic stage play. In the preface or the prologue to the published version of the play, look at how he describes himself. Look at how he describes himself and how he describes writing a Gothic play. Far from the haunts of men, of vice the foe, that should be men, not me, sorry about the typo. The moonstruck child of genius and of woe, versed in each magic spell and dear to dame, a fair enchantress dwells, romance her name. What is romance in this context? It means simply imaginative fiction. The imagination, it's not love and hearts and roses. She loathes the sun or blazing tapers light, the moonbeamed landscape and tempestuous night. Alone she loved, and oft with glimmering lamp, near graves new opened or midst dungeons damp, drear forests, ruined isles, and haunted towers, forlorn she roves and raves away the hours. So you've got a young man visiting the spirit of the imagination, the spirit of romance, at an ancient ruined edifice. And indeed, the play that follows, The Castle Spectre, look at the architectural signifier, is set in the medieval period in the time-bowered towers of Castle Conwy in North Wales. We can still visit it today, which is the haunted castle referred to in the play's title. So Gothic architectural ruin drives the work of the Gothic literary imagination in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Here's another example. This is William Godwin, the father of Mary Shelley, the great Gothic novelist, the great political philosopher, the husband to Mary Wollstonecraft, the pioneering feminist. He writes a kind of biography of Geoffrey Chaucer in 1804, and he discusses the kind of worldview of Chaucer, and he talks a bit about Gothic architecture. Look at what he says about Gothic architecture. These ancient palaces also had a number of other characteristics which, look at that, seize the imagination. Look at the imaginative lure of Gothic architecture, and have lately been called up with great success by the inventors of fictitious narratives. That's another word for saying writers of popular romance, Gothic fictions, Gothic novels. Such are their trapdoors for descent, their long protracted galleries. There's a gallery in this building, I'm sure. Their immense suite of rooms opening one beyond the other. Their chapels constituting a part of the mansion, by means of which the solitary explorer of the building unexpectedly descends among the monuments of the dead and the crumbling memorials of departed religion, and their arras hangings, with ill-contrived and rattling doors concealed behind them. He's effectively writing his own little Gothic fiction there, isn't he? Being chased through a labyrinthine Gothic castle. This tendency will also be parodied. I love this. It's a kind of spoof, very much like Jane Austen's spoof in Northanger Abbey. This is a satirical take on the writer of Gothic fiction from 1810 in an anonymous poem called The Age, describing a Gothic author. She goes with look enthusiastic to yonder edifice fantastic. It's very bad poetry, do bear with me. Where fancy speaking from its trances gives inspiration of romances. Here votaries crowd of all conditions to view the fleeting exhibitions, and, well as crazy brain permits, sketch down each vision as it flits. While deeper mysteries are brewing, they see at first a Gothic ruin. That's an awful one, isn't it? This seems to be a rule of late from which none dare to deviate. 'Tis castle large with turrets high, intruding always on the sky. And as they're old in face of clothes, around them ivy kindly grows. Somewhat like Adam's coat or Eve's, except for fig, their ivy leaves. So time today, this evening, prevents a kind of exploration of the many different types of ruins that Gothic novels deal with: castles, forts, monasteries, priories. There are numerous kinds of medieval ruins at the heart of Gothic writing. So what I'm going to stick to is just one example, one that is particularly close to my heart. And towards the end, as I draw to the end, you will see why. I'm going to talk about the ruined abbey as one particular Gothic ruin that is prominent in Gothic romance. I've already introduced it to you with that opening example from Whitby Abbey. I thought I'd choose an example from Yorkshire, although a very different part of Yorkshire, and it's featuring in Dracula. And of course, to mention this connection between ruined Gothic abbeys and Gothic fiction being so strong that Jane Austen would very humorously parody it in Northanger Abbey, written in the late 1790s, but only published later. So the ruined and purportedly haunted abbey is especially associated with the work of Anne Radcliffe. Now, one of my life's ambitions, or part of my life's work, is to popularize and to make Anne Radcliffe far better known than she is, and hopefully a number of events will be forthcoming. Has anyone read Anne Radcliffe? Got some people who've read Anne Radcliffe. Anyone heard of her? Beyond? Okay, so she's there, not too bad. Unarguably, Anne Radcliffe was the most popular, successful, and highly remunerated and highly praised Gothic romancer of the late 18th century. You can see a list of her publications on the screen. Now, the ruined abbey first appears in her early novel, The Castles of Athen and Dunbayne, set in Scotland, but it is most vividly realized in her bestseller of 1791, called The Romance of the Forest, in a scene that would be tirelessly replayed in so many Gothic fictions of the late 18th century. Let me tell you what happens just in this episode in the ruined abbey in the Romance of the Forest. It's in a ruined abbey in the forest of the novel's title that the heroine, a young woman called Adeline, is visited in a dream by the ghost of her murdered father. She's a kind of fugitive, a renegade. She's vulnerable, she's fleeing, she doesn't know what, she's homeless for portions, and she takes refuge in a ruined abbey with some people who kind of take her under their wing. And she is visited as she sleeps in the ruined abbey by the ghost of her murdered father, who proceeds to reveal to her the truth behind his dreadful murder at the hands of his own brother. What are you thinking? Ghosts, sibling rivalry? You're thinking of Hamlet, aren't you? The whereabouts of a moth-eaten, almost illegible manuscript in which he has written down his story, as well as the location of his skeletal body that is buried in a trunk. So let's reflect for a bit upon this Gothic convention, which after Radcliffe will really take off and feature timelessly in early Gothic fictions. I hope it'll draw the various parts of this lecture together. Let's reflect on this haunted, ruined abbey, asking ourselves where such concerns come from. What are their possible cultural meanings and functions in the 18th century? Now, we know, of course, that it is to Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, Henry and Thomas Cromwell's program for the dissolution of the monasteries between 1530 and early 1540s, that we should look for an explanation as to why it is there are so many of Britain's ruined religious houses still existing today in a state of ruin, and many, of course, in Yorkshire. It's by no means, the destruction of the monasteries was by no means an instantaneous event. It was systematic destruction, despoliation of Britain's Catholic religious houses, an ongoing process after an initial flurry of focused activity that lasted decades, especially through the ongoing processes of weather, despoliation, cultural neglect, etc. No sooner had the religious houses fallen, though, than they took up a life in writing, not only in antiquarian studies like William Dugdale, but also famously in Shakespeare. You know Sonnet 73, don't you? The often quoted line, "Bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang." Probably written 1590, so that's around 60 years after the dissolution of the monasteries, first printed in 1609. Look at how the ruined abbey there becomes a site of vacancy, of nostalgia and loss. There's this element of mourning in Shakespeare's line in that sonnet. The speaker of Shakespeare's poem, like several other early modern personages, is engaged in a degree of mourning for the loss of these splendid buildings. For those of you who know your early modern literature, your Renaissance literature, you will know John Webster's The Duchess of Malfi. The ruined abbey would also feature in Act 4 of John Webster's proto-Gothic, sort of Gothic before the Gothic, Jacobean tragedy, The Duchess of Malfi from 1812 to 1813. There's that one point in the play when the eponymous Duchess is dead. She's been brutally strangled by her brother, the Cardinal, and she lies buried, unbeknown to the characters on the stage. But the audience hears ghostly echoes, almost like the ghost of the murdered Duchess, as her lover Antonio and his interlocutor talk to one another in a churchyard beside a ruined abbey. The voice of what, to all intents and purposes, is the voice of the dead Duchess of Malfi from beyond the grave, rendering this ruined abbey in the play and the churchyard nearby as a kind of site of the uncanny, the Freudian uncanny. It's a clear anticipation of the Gothic imagination of later centuries. Another example that you might know, John Milton, our wonderful poet of Paradise Lost and Comus and much else besides. Look at how the ruined abbey in Milton's Il Penseroso from the 1630s becomes a site or a locale or a place of rumination, of melancholic reflection. Look at the final stanza. "But let my dew feet never fail to walk the studious cloisters pale, and love the high embowered roof with antique pillars massy proof, and storied windows." By storied windows, you're thinking of stained glass. "And storied windows richly dight," here's the killer of a line, "casting a dim religious light. There let the pealing organ blow to the full-voiced choir below, in service high and anthems clear, as may with sweetness through mine ear dissolve me into ecstasies and bring all heaven before mine eyes." An almost sacred, though secular, experience of rumination, reflection, melancholy in a ruined abbey. Now, Milton's sense, to take us closer to the Gothic, Milton's sense of the ruined abbey as a site of mournful reflection would be very much compounded and enhanced by the so-called graveyard school of the 1740s. Graveyard poetry, so, Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard. Graveyard poetry, it's a type of poetry given over to reflection and to rumination on the brevity of life, the folly of life, the inevitability of death, often set in overgrown churchyards, charnel houses, sites of architectural ruin, often punctuated with moments of horror and terror and the supernatural. And this all drives Walpole's experiment. He publishes Thomas Gray, of course. But in the extract from your screen, I want to show you a kind of key moment where Gothic abbeys' ruins become haunted. Joseph Addison, the great Whig writer, man of letters from the early 18th century, describes in an essay in The Spectator, a short-lived kind of, but very influential publication, magazine, not like the magazine today, from the early 18th century. He describes a visit, a nighttime visit to a ruin nearby nearby the house of one of his friends. Now, this is interesting in a number of counts. Firstly, there is a tradition in the 18th century of visiting ruins by night. This is long before any kind of heritage industry, long before any kind of Pevsner guides, guidebooks. But there is a tradition of going to ruins at night, often with flaming tapers, obviously enhancing the chill factor, the sublimity of the scene. And he describes a nighttime visit to a ruin. He's staying with a friend, Sir Roger Clovelly, and Sir Roger Clovelly's servants say, oh, don't go there. It's purportedly haunted. Don't go to that ruin. But he persists, and he goes to this ruin by nightfall. And look at his description. The ruins of the abbey are scattered up and down on every side, and half covered with ivy and elder bushes, the harbours of several solitary birds which seldom make their appearance till the dusk of the evening. The place was formerly a churchyard, and has still several marks in it of graves and burying places. There is such an echo among the old ruins. That's reminding me of precisely that scene in The Duchess of Malfi that I've just described. And vaults that if you stamp but a little louder than ordinary, you hear the sound repeated, this echoey chasm of a ruined abbey at night. At the same time, the walk of elms with the croaking of the ravens, which from time to time are heard from the tops of them, looks exceedingly solemn and venerable. Now, here's the important bit. These objects naturally raise seriousness and attention. And when night heightens the awfulness of the place and pours out her supernumerary horrors upon everything in it, I do not at all wonder that weak minds fill it with spectres and apparitions. So he's taking a jibe at the servant classes. And there's that long-standing connection between popular superstitions, belief in ghosts, and working class people in the 18th century. And that's coming through here. There you can see that the ruined abbey becomes a site of what he calls supernumerary horror. Now let's think about that briefly. What is it that is so horrific about the remains of the medieval Catholic past? Why does the 18th century find ruins of abbeys and priories, and particularly religious houses, horrific? In order to answer this question, we have to acknowledge that 18th century Britain was a vehemently, self-consciously Protestant nation. In fact, it was only a shared sense of Protestantism that held together the disparate assemblage of nations that had been brought together by the Acts of Union of 1707, that moment at which the very notion of Great Britain was forged. Consequently, national identity in the 18th century was very much based upon an assumption of shared Protestantism. And with this, of course, came the demonization of Britain's enemies, most of them historically Catholic, Catholic Ireland, France, the Jacobite threat from Scotland associated with Catholicism, a normalization in 18th century culture of vociferous anti-Catholicism, both legal, state-sanctioned, and discursive towards Catholics. Now, it's within such a context of religious and political mistrust that ruined abbeys that so dominated the landscape ever since the dissolution of the monasteries spoke to English Protestants of the glorious vanquishing of the darkness of the Catholic past at the time of the Reformation. An example of this is in William Shenstone's poem, The Ruined Abbey, or The Effects of Superstition, which is from 1743, in which the ruined abbey is described as a kind of nursery of superstition, in which reviled Catholics once resided, but which, in its ruined form in the present, kind of attests to the triumph of Protestantism, the triumph of British reason, the triumph of British liberation from the yoke of Rome. So there's something very positive that British 18th century Protestants see in these ruined abbeys. Despite such triumphant, optimistic readings, though, I'm going to give you another example from Thomas Warton the Younger, influential 18th century poet, 1745, in a poem called The Pleasures of Melancholy. Again, it's about a ruined abbey. Beneath yon ruined abbey's moss-grown piles, oft let me sit at twilight hour of eve, where through some western window the pale moon pours her long levelled rule of streaming light, while sullen sacred silence reigns around, and the lone screech owl's note, who builds his bower amid the mouldering caverns dark and damp, or the calm breeze that rustles in the leaves of flaunting ivy, that with mantle green invests some wasted tower. Or let me tread in neighbouring walk of pines, where mused of old the cloistered brother, through the gloomy void that far extends beneath their ample arch, as on I pace, religious horror wraps my soul in dread repose. Look at that phrase, religious horror wraps my soul. But when the world is clad in midnight's raven-coloured robe, again an indication of visiting these ruins at night, mid hollow charnels let me watch the flame of taper dim shedding a living glare o'er the one heaps, while airy voices talk along the glimmering walls, or ghostly shape at distance seen invites with beckoning hand my lonesome steps through the far winding vaults. Do you notice here the emphasis upon religious horror and how the abbey remains haunted by the ghosts, the revenants, my title, of the Catholic past? This is partly why William Gilpin, the father of the picturesque, which is another topic entirely I could speak for an hour on, argued that ruined ecclesiastical buildings must be emptied out or exorcised, figuratively speaking, of their Catholic past, the memory of their Catholic history, so that they simply serve as objects of picturesque, two-dimensional, ahistorical contemplation in the present. So, my final point. To conclude, in the Gothic imagination of the late 18th century, ruined abbeys become sites of religious horror, of gross Catholic indiscretion, especially indiscretion of a sexual nature. They are cesspits of sexual activity, both homoerotic and heterosexual, male and female, male relationships, female relationships, and female relationships. Broken vows of celibacy abound, leading to pregnant nuns who are often buried alive, as they are in Matthew Gregory Lewis's The Monk, a novel I've referred to before, and as they are in the poem by Walter Scott, Marmion, that I referred to at the beginning. Several Gothic or supernatural tales are set in real-life ruined abbeys and monasteries of Britain. Townshend Abbey, for example, Netley Abbey, but also imaginary abbeys and priories. I'm going to finish by skipping what I want to do because I'm worried about time, by talking a little bit about work I've been doing. I've been talking about the 18th century in this lecture. I've recently completed a program of public engagements called Revenants and Remains. You can write down the title, because what we've done is we've chosen 5 ruined abbeys in the north of England, North Yorkshire and Cumbria. And I've tried to update this architectural imagination by taking school children, by taking groups of creative writers, and by leading tours for English heritage members around 5 of the ruins, Revo and Byland in particular, which you will know. And what we've tried to do is we've tried to recreate that 18th century interest in ruin and its centrality to the imagination and writing Gothic fiction, poems, short stories. We've had Rosie Garland, the very well-known Manchester-based Gothic novelist, running creative writing workshops in these ruins. We've had Sarah Sparks, a very well-known ghost photographer, working with A-level students, photography students, creating ghostly photographic interpretations of these ruins, engaging people in heritage through the supernatural, through the Gothic imagination, from medieval ghost stories right the way through to later Gothic fictions. On our website, that's why I said you should write down just the name Revenants and Remains. If you Google it, it'll come up. You can download the photographs and an ebook and all the creative writing that has been generated by this project. So what I've done is I've given you kind of the historical background to this and ended off with a real life modern example, hopefully inspiring you all to visit local sites of heritage and to engage with them creatively and imaginatively through the Gothic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. Absolutely wonderful. We've got a few moments left if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask. Anyone going to be brave and put their hand up first? Yes.
Can I try one, please? Is there an overlap between Gothic architecture, the pre-Raphaelite movement, and the arts and craft movement?
Oh, yes, undeniably. There is a kind of medievalism that unites them all. But the key person in that regard is a later theorist of Gothic architecture, who's John Ruskin, who will write in the Stones of Venice, that very important chapter on the nature of Gothic, that will celebrate Gothic architecture for everything that it says about the medieval past, the use of craft, the use of guilds, the use of organic form, the use of working together, the use of collaboration. And it is precisely those values that he manages to access via Gothic architecture that drives the arts and crafts movement. And it's no coincidence that William Morris will produce at the Kelmscott Press one of his own editions of the nature of Gothic, that one chapter from the Stones of Venice. So yes, there's a very, very clear connection, a kind of reclaimed medievalism, because the medievalism that Pugin before Ruskin and then Ruskin are dealing with is not this horrific, ghostly, haunted, overly sexualized, passionate Gothic or medieval past of the Gothic novel. There's a kind of reclaimed Gothic that happens in the early 19th century, and a reinvention of the Gothic past that is facilitated by the coining of the word medieval. They're no longer using the swear word Gothic. They now have, from 1817 onwards, the word medieval. And with that comes a whole range of changes around perceptions of the medieval past. And Ruskin and the arts and craft movement and the pre-Raphaelites are part of that refined, reformed medievalism of the 19th century.
Thank you. Any more questions?
It's less about the lecture, sorry, and just more what you said about young people. Are there still opportunities through English Heritage and the projects that you're working on to take young people out just as a teacher?
I would love to. Email me, and that project is closed, but it's ongoing. So this particular part has closed, but well, not closed, it's finite because it was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. But I can certainly get funding, access to funding to do similar events with English Heritage and school children. It's very difficult to...
Creative writing in that kind of setting, I think, would be wonderful. So, yeah.
Email me, please.
Thanks very much for that. Any final questions before we wrap up for the evening? Just one at the front, yeah?
You started off by talking about Horace Walpole, and there was a huge amount of content in that of the elements that he introduced into the writing. They must have come from somewhere. What were his influences?
Well, this is a fascinating question. He claims that a transo came to him in a dream. And in the summer of 1764, I awaked one night, he says, and dreamt of a giant hand in armor upon the banister here at Strawberry Hill, next to the armory. There's a medieval armory in Strawberry Hill, and he has this dream. So on the one hand, so what happens? He has this dream of this giant hand in armor resting on the banister. He wakes, and we're told in the time of 6 weeks, he writes the Castle of Otranto. So purportedly inspired by a dream. But the next comment he makes in that very letter where he describes this dream, he says, this is to be expected for someone with a head like mine filled with Gothic story. So that phrase Gothic story interests me. It's exactly what he will use on the title page to the second edition. Let's go back of a Gothic story. For a head like mine filled with Gothic story. Now, in answer to your question, there's the dream, but Gothic story is, I think, the ultimate source. And by Gothic story, he meant medieval and mostly Renaissance romances. So Tasso, Ariosto, Cervantes, but also in the English tradition, Shakespeare. This is the whole text is a homage to Shakespeare, who in the 18th century is seen as our Gothic bard. That is the phrase used to refer to him by Walpole's closest friends, actually. So he is drawing very much on what he understood to be Gothic writers, not Gothic in the horror, terror, supernatural sense per se, but Gothic in the sense of being what we would now call historical or medieval or Renaissance. They had neither of those terms. And the Gothic is a kind of historical category that joins all of those older writers together. So Shakespeare, Spenser, Milton, Ariosto, Tasso, elements of Chaucer too, although Chaucer's not big in how the 18th century sees the Gothic past.
Well, I'm going to shake your hand up. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Gentlemen, Dale, thank you very much.